A few other people have already made videos analyzing how specifically Encanto and/or Turning Red depict situations of older generations holding back and poisoning the youth with their outdated values. And I appreciate that approach, but I want to attempt to contribute a more top-down perspective of Disney's output over the past year. That is, the progressive evolution of how much detail Disney/Pixar decides to go into with the subject matter of intergenerational trauma and what we can draw from this timeline of the studio's recent movies, rather than going super in-depth with any one of their films individually. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about Raya and the Last Dragon, Luca, Encanto, and Turning Red, which will necessitate spoilers for all of them, so turn away now if that matters to you. For those remaining, I want to get something out of the way right away. Youth rising to higher heights than their predecessors, recognizing and casting away the unnecessary aspects of tradition, as well as the older generation realizing the error in their ways with the clarity provided to them by their offspring, are all story archetypes that have been told for hundreds if not thousands of years. I do not claim that Disney/Pixar has undergone some core shift in ideology which they have been expressing more and more in their films. I think this trend that I've noticed is nearly pure coincidence, perhaps spurred by a gradual cultural evolution insofar as how we view generations today. We as a collective have become more and more aware of the differences between ourselves currently and our recent past as a result of the meteoric rise in documentative technology. But let's be honest, a bunch of movies that came out close to one another having overlapping subject matter is far from a statistical anomaly. Unless Lightyear somehow continues this trend, which would be incredible. So anyway, the past 4 original Disney Pixar films, Raya, Luca, Encanto, and Turning Red in that order, have progressively honed in on a message about intergenerational trauma, and by way of their chronological release order, they create something of a meta-narrative around this topic. By the way, if you really wanted to stretch this thesis, you could arguably include Soul on the list to make it seem like the trend begins a few months earlier, since it makes the most tangential contact with the idea that a teacher who doesn't have their students' best interests in mind will do them more harm than good. But in Soul, that's not out of misunderstanding on the part of Joe, the teacher, but rather apathy. And I think that's enough of a key distinction between Soul and everything that came after it to convince me to start with Raya and the Last Dragon. So, starting with Raya, you wouldn't immediately assume that this is a movie about recognizing the errors in the ways of the older generation and moving past them. That's because it's not. It's about, as the film explicitly states, trust, and how consistently placing your trust in others is a practice that will reward you when those people do good on that trust. How agreeable that message is and how well it pulls it off is up for debate, but I'm not really trying to make a moral judgment on this film or even critique its overall quality. What I am interested in is how it uses the concepts of generational trauma and generational agency to support its plot. Namaari, the movie's main antagonist and foil to its titular character, gained Raya's trust at the beginning of the film and exploited that trust for her own gain, causing, in part, the further splintering of their world and the effective death of everyone Raya cares about. Except Tuk Tuk. Naturally, this makes putting trust in Namaari the biggest hurdle for Raya, particularly after Namaari yet again betrayed that trust by killing Sisu when Raya and the gang willingly gave her the opportunity. The most intense force that our main character is challenged with, both physically and thematically, is Namaari. Namaari exists to service Raya's arc and the theme of the film, not to be a compelling study all on her own. I'm establishing this because none of that story requires hand-waving Namaari's actions as not her fault. If the film were interested in having a more nuanced discussion about its subject matter, trust, then maybe. But as it stands, Raya and the Last Dragon isn't trying to have that conversation. And yet, the film seems to add as much window dressing as possible to indicate that the sole source of Namaari's villainhood is her mother's influence on her. When Namaari betrays Raya for the second time, it's because she doesn't have any other choice. When she suggests intercepting Raya at Spine, it shows that she's growing into the leader her mom raised her to be. They even have this Wall-E-esque child indoctrination scene where Varana refers to the monsters that want to destroy us, and it's kept ambiguous if she's referring to the Druun or the other clans, or both. Moreover, in that same scene, Namaari is shown to have that genuine spark of goodness inside of her, admitting that Fang was responsible for breaking the clans apart and believing that Sisu can fix it, only to have that spark stamped out by her mother, further instilling a lack of trust for the other clans into Namaari. Lack of trust, which Raya in The Last Dragon equates to moral corruption, is very much rooted in the past generation of primarily Fang, but also seemingly every clan that doesn't start the film with the MacGuffin Dragon Orb that is the physical embodiment of trust, and which fuels the dragon's magic. and that older generation is extremely intent on disseminating their values into the younger generation, believing that this is the only way to make it in a world like this. Again, Raya isn't explicitly about any of these messages, but it visibly uses these ideas to facilitate the story it's trying to tell, especially watching it over again now with different optics. At the time, I don't think anyone was really discussing the film's preconceived assumptions about the nature of generational relationships, and I think a big reason why is because these ideas were well woven into the story. They don't feel artificial, and I think that made it easier for audiences to accept that this is just the way Raya's world is. Luca gets a lot more explicit with its depiction of its titular character's parents, particularly the mom, and the values that she attempts to instill in Luca. I'd even argue that it begins the trend we'll see more of later on, being that it leans into the contrast between the two generations' ideologies as a conflict more than it does any tangible threat to our protagonist. In Luca's case, that tangible threat is the human population who would literally hunt him down and seemingly murder him if they knew the truth that he is a sea monster. I think that because Luca and Alberto so quickly find and befriend Giulia, who is so unmistakably someone who will look past their sea monsterness and view them as real people, also probably because this is a movie for kids, it was never a worry in my mind that Luca and Alberto were ever really in any danger of the humans around them. But Luca's parents separating him from the new friends he's made and sending him away with his uncle to live in the depths of the sea feels like a lot more present of a threat. It's the consequence that Luca consistently talks about being afraid of throughout the entirety of the film, and the one that gets its resolution in the falling action and closing scene of the movie, wherein it's revealed that Alberto has convinced Luca's family to allow him to go to school despite their concerns. Like Raya, Luca still has another theme that it treats as more important, and which the difference in generations highlights: that you will be more fulfilled as a person if you express yourself authentically and genuinely pursue your ambitions. But unlike Raya, it is directly acknowledged that the attitude which challenges that central theme is held and propagated by the main character's family.
Wow, we look horrifying.
Ugh, gross.
Raya would drop all of these not at all subtle hints that Namaari's mom was the source of her evilness, but the movie didn't actually have anything to say about that. Once the dragons are revived, Kumandra is restored, and both Namaari and Virana have completely changed sides, now being won over by the power of trust. Worthy of mention is that this is the first time we've seen Virana since the child indoctrination scene I mentioned earlier, unless you count this 4-second reaction shot and her being petrified, which, you know. Point is, we see absolutely none of Virana's transformation. We see the before and after, but not the coming to terms with her mistaken values, apologizing for pushing them onto the youth of Fang, and making the choice to value trust instead. Like I said, this is all window dressing to the more focused on aspects of the film, but in contrast, notice how Luca includes the parents and their change in perspective in all 3 of the last scenes of the movie. First, we see Daniela's excitement over seeing Luca win the race, contrasted by her simultaneous concern for his safety. Then we see her deliberation over whether to maintain her strict control of Luca's life for his own safety, or allow him to continue living with humans for his own happiness. And finally, we see her decision, including how she came to it, and her conditions for Luca. This is the difference between implicit and explicit acknowledgement of this theme, which is the major step that Luca takes in furthering this generational focus, and thus could be taken as Disney sort of recognizing that Namaari and other characters like her are that way because of their parents. But before we continue down the list, I'd like to have you keep in mind that although Luca, the movie, clearly conveys that the older generation has something of an obligation to step aside and allow their kids to spread their wings, it is very much still portrayed that this is their choice. They are in control, they give Luca permission to go to human school. And I bring this up because it's a portrayal of the relationship that will be challenged in the not too immediate future. But that said, now we're entering the films that you were probably thinking of when you heard my thesis statement. Encanto is obviously the point where this trend passes over from explicitly part of the experience to literally what the movie is about. I don't think it'll take too long to explain this one if you've seen the movie. Nearly everything in the film is directly the cause or effect of Abuela Alma's treatment of her family. Encanto, I think, is sort of like what we would get if the creators of Raya and Luca decided to make a movie that was just about Namaari's relationship with her mom, or just about Luca's relationship with his parents. I also think that Encanto, in a really fascinating way, fleshes out this attribute of its 2 immediate predecessors. What I mean by that is that after watching Encanto, I feel like a rewatch of Raya and the Last Dragon as well as Luca have more entertainment value because you can read Encanto's exploration of its younger and older generations into the younger and older generations of both Raya and Luca. Needless to say, they aren't one-to-one parallels. Encanto, for instance, has a lot more direct victims of Abuela Alma's unhealthy expectations, resulting in 1. Showing us more ways that the younger generation could react to the elder generation's expectations than you could reasonably get out of just one character, and 2. Highlighting that all of these different problems, each being dealt with by different people, came from the same source. And I think that latter effect is also what Encanto should really be credited with on this list. Yes, it focuses on the theme of negative generational influence more than anything thus far, but we were already on an upward trajectory in that department. What neither Raya nor Luca even begin to do, which Encanto does, is explore the cause of the bad influence. Both Virana and Luca's parents explain their philosophies and values to each of their respective children. However, people don't generally just have values because it's the way that they were born, or because they just did a bunch of thinking. Usually, specific events occurred in their lifetime which shaped their worldview, and that's what we get to see in Encanto. The reason why Alma has such high standards for her kids and grandkids is because she endured trauma in her past, which was the result of poor life circumstances, speculated to be the Colombian Thousand Days War. And the last thing she wants for her family is to experience what she went through. So she pressures everyone to strengthen their community and strengthen their homes so that they don't even have the chance to find themselves in similar circumstances to those that forced Alma to flee from her and her husband's initial home. This is why Encanto makes Raya and Luca retroactively better. It prompts deeper thought about what might have happened to the older generations in each film, and it doesn't take much effort at all to think of a lot of things that could have happened to Luca's parents and Virana that are just as bad, if not worse than what happened to Abuela Alma, considering the worlds that each film take place in. And with that newfound focus being placed on what caused the problem rather than just the protagonist solving it, we can start to assign blame for how the problem came to be, as well as appropriate responsibility and agency in the process of solving it. And that is where Turning Red comes in. Whereas Encanto treats the cause of the Madrigal candle's flame weakening, an explicit metaphor for the family's dysfunctionality, as a mystery to be uncovered as the story goes on, Turning Red is very clear about how Ming's expectations of May are causing her a lot of unnecessary stress from the very beginning of the film, and it spends the bulk of its runtime attempting to make Ming understand that. This is what allows Turning Red to have more of those scenes that so many people feel have been ripped straight out of their own adolescence, as opposed to Encanto's wider relatability. And in giving Ming's development the time of day to develop, even before she finally comes to terms with what her daughter needs from her, Turning Red illustrates what the parent needs to change in themselves to suit their successor, both for the benefit of the next generation, but also for the sake of not losing the relationship with their child that they so cherish. In other words, Turning Red makes the conflict not just May's problem. Ming is framed as the victim of her actions just as much as May, because when May finally confronts her with the truth that she's never going to conform to the image that Ming had set for her, it becomes Ming's choice to decide how she will ultimately feel about this. She can either continue pushing against May or accept it. Either way, May is still going to be obsessed with boys and listen to loud music and gyrate. The older generation is portrayed as having less agency than the younger generation. May is 13 and Ming has to deal with it. To draw the Luca parallel I put a pin in earlier, Ming can't decide for May whether or not she'll go to human school. I mean, obviously she could, but symbolically that's not what Turning Red is communicating. Or if we apply these characters to Encanto, Ming's support of May's deviation from her expectations has no effect on whether or not May's gift comes back. I'm actually kind of surprised that no one, to my knowledge, has pointed out that latter difference yet, given how much people seem to be aware of the parallels between Turning Red and Encanto, and frankly, how surface level that observation is. Both films have this element of a superpower being passed down through the generations of the family the movie is focused on. These powers are characterized as being a core part of each family member's personhood, and the loss of those powers is seen as either losing or locking away an integral part of who you are. And in Turning Red, May has complete individual control over whether or not she keeps her powers, as opposed to Encanto, in which the character's gifts are conditional to the children maintaining a functional relationship with Abuela Alma. The best way I could describe it is that Turning Red takes the increasingly focused on relationship between an older generation who places unhealthily high expectations on a younger generation, and that younger generation who struggles to maintain the image of what their elder wants them to be while also exploring what defines them outside of those expectations, and gives the younger generation the reins. And I think that's interesting because Namari, Luca, and the Madrigal family all have objectively less dependency on their elders than Mei. All these other characters are adults and or appear fairly capable of getting by without their parents' help. Mei Li is canonically a normal 13-year-old girl living in real-world Toronto, Ontario, Canada. She cannot run away from her home, get a job somewhere, and start living on her own. Maybe her dad's family could take her in, but we don't get any sort of hints that that's on the table. And yet, Mei is portrayed by far the most as not needing her parents' approval. Turning Red introduces an element of empowerment towards the younger generation in relation to the older generation, something that had been quite absent for the past 3 Disney films. Now, again, that's not to say that Turning Red is the best of these 4 films. I think all of them are good in their own way, and despite my comparisons between them, it's very clear that they are not trying to tell the same story. However, now that I've gotten this whole meta-narrative laid out in front of us, I do want to talk about which parts of these films appeal to me, specifically those that relate to the theme of generational trauma. That way I can describe what my hypothetical ideal addition to this chain of films might look like. Earlier I mentioned that I think Encanto makes its predecessors better retroactively because it goes into significantly more depth about why the older generation is the way that it is, and how exactly their expectations of the younger generation negatively affects them. And these are the kinds of elements that I really want to see adapted into another film, specifically relative to Luca and Turning Red. I say this because these are the 2 films that have children as their main characters. As a result, I feel like there's more to imagine in Luca and Turning Red that happens after each film ends. And in the same way that Encanto allows us to read in between the lines in Raya and Luca, I think it would be really cool to be able to imagine a sequel to Luca or Turning Red based on a future film. Luca's credits would seem to agree with me. And of course that film would be especially successful at this by being centrally about the lingering effects of their older generation's influence on the main character for a period of time past when they are self-dependent. Basically, the main character should be an adult. That was something I really appreciated about Raya specifically. I like the confidence with which Raya and Namari carry themselves and challenge each other in a way that really sells their history. It makes them feel like they've been doing this song and dance for a long time, which they have been. I want to take that and mix it with Alberto's struggle in Luca, which was one of my favorite aspects about the film because it was left up to interpretation. Alberto frequently refers to an inner voice in his head named Bruno that basically warns him when he's doing something stupidly dangerous. I like how this subtly but definitely calls attention to the fact that while independence is important, unchecked rebellion can be damaging. And I think that this is a really interesting conflict in this context and deserving of future exploration. Okay, but here's where it gets juicy. This hypothetical main character's parent who taught them a bunch of good life lessons but also fostered some really unhealthy attitudes in them? Yeah, the parent is dead. In all these other Disney movies I've talked about, the older generation eventually learns how they messed up and makes a change in themselves by the end of the 3rd act. Not in my movie. I want to be clear though, I'm not denying the older generation the chance for redemption because I think any of the examples we've seen thus far are undeserving of it. I'm specifically proposing this because I want to take the independence which Turning Red empowers Mei with to the absolute extreme. And frankly, because sometimes the older generation just doesn't get the chance, whether it's due to them never being confronted with the trauma they've inflicted on their child, them actually being unwilling to change, or them simply being absent from their child's life. And you know, while it's absolutely fine to depict a parent growing and learning with their child, I think there are a lot of people who can relate to having to mature and become more independent without that kind of support. Perhaps this character is a little boy who doesn't like sports, but his dad forces him to take martial arts classes and isn't happy about his son's lack of enthusiasm. The boy grows to resent his father until one day their house gets broken into by some criminals or something, and the dad whips out some sick fighting moves to incapacitate one of the robbers and give his family time to escape. But then the other one jumps on his dad and they, kill him. Now understanding the value of what his father was trying to teach him, the importance of self-defense, our main character gains admiration for his dad, but feels horrible because he'll never be able to make his father understand that. Because he's dead. So, main character starts imitating his dad, getting way into martial arts and turning into a bit of a hard-ass himself. Flash forward to much later in his life when an injury yields the main character unable to fight for an extended period of time. Maybe this is even an injury that will affect his ability to fight permanently. This causes him to reflect on why he wanted to be a fighter in the first place, prompting deeper self-reflection about his relationship with his father. He tosses and turns with the issue for a bit before finally accepting that his dad was a flawed man, but his influence also did a lot of good for the main character, and that he doesn't need his dad to redeem the darker parts of himself or to have been a perfect person in the first place. Because either way, our main character has to move on in whatever way will be the most healthy for him. And sad as it is, it's not like his dad is coming back to life anytime soon, so it's not really helpful to get hung up on the "if only I had done this differently" thoughts. It doesn't really matter if he ultimately decides to keep fighting by the end of the movie, because whatever decision he makes, he will have made it with this new enlightened mindset. Maybe he realizes that martial arts doesn't actually make him happy. Maybe he discovers that he found a genuine love for the sport somewhere along his journey. Maybe honoring his dad, or at least his dad's intentions, is a genuine reason for why he might love it. All that's really important is that the main character is doing what he feels would be best for him, and that he came to that conclusion himself. Basically imagine like a mix between The Princess and the Frog and The Atom Project, but without time travel. Obviously, I'm not a scriptwriter or a storyboarder, so I don't know if this even is an idea that might make for a compelling movie, but hopefully my sales pitch was interesting. Honestly, I have a bunch more notes about these films and what elements of theirs I think could be built upon, but they get pretty scattered from here, and I think I've made my point, so I'm just going to reiterate that I'm not claiming that Disney is intentionally weaving this whole intergenerational trauma meta-narrative. These themes are nothing new for Disney or stories in general. I just wanted to exercise a little cinematic comparison for the sake of a thought experiment. Anyway, pledge to my Patreon if you want to support what I do. Thanks for dropping by, and have a good day.